Hey, it's time for Thoughts on Thursday, where I share what's been on my mind and you share what you think about it in the comments section below. Please subscribe and share, click the notification bell. Again, I appreciate it so much. So today I'll be discussing what I've learned from Lecture 3 from the Great Courses Plus. I am not sponsored by them, but get the app and follow them. It's pretty cool. So this is The Rise of Communism, from Marx to Lenin, the Communist Manifesto, and Das Kapital, as taught by Dr. V.S. Gabriel Lulevicius of the University of Tennessee. We'll be going over how Marx and Engels tried to put into action their revolutionary message, and a closer look at their Communist Manifesto and Marx's Das Kapital that he struggled for years and failed to complete. I can relate to that. And we'll go over Marx's model of history and economics and his reaction to capitalism, and basic vocabulary of Marx's concepts, and a closer look at the revolutionary lives Marx and Engels lived, seeking unity of theory and practice. So Marx and his family had been expelled from France by the request of the Prussian government, quote, which was upset by his writings, end quote. Marx and Engels went to Brussels, the capital of Belgium, where they began writing and arguing over every word of a document that they felt was of utmost importance, since they believed they were charting the course for the future of human civilization. The manifesto was written for a small group of political radicals calling themselves communists. They saw themselves already being a world power, as anticipated in the manifesto. The manifesto has phrases that will, quote, ring down throughout the following century and a half, from the opening line, "A specter is haunting Europe," to "All history is a history of class struggle," and closed with, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Workers of the world, unite." This document that shaped history up until our time was actually at first ignored, which will be discussed later, but quick vocabulary: what is a proletarian? It's a singular form of the proletariat, which is a Marxist term for workers or working class people. It derived from ancient Rome, where it meant the lowest class of citizens, according to the definitions from Oxford Languages. Marx insisted on the unity of theory and practice. Quote, his own scientific socialism was to unleash revolutionary experiments with the goal of breaking through to a new stage of human history, creating new human beings. Marx wrote in his thesis on Feuerbach in 1845, quote, philosophers hitherto have only interpreted the world in various ways. The thing is, however, to change it, end quote. In 1847, Marx and Engels completed a rough draft of the Communist Manifesto, and the timing of its completion seemed to be perfect, since it was the start of many revolutions taking place throughout Europe in 1848. It would make sense that it was the inspiration for all these revolutions, but it wasn't until later when it actually became significant. Marx and Engels were excited by this atmosphere of revolution, since they'd been hoping for something like this to happen. But these Europe-wide revolutions failed. They were not communist revolutions, but liberal and nationalists wanting to overcome old monarchies and establish new republics, constitutions, and national unification in what they called the springtime of nations. That was quote, end quote. In the meantime, none of these revolutionaries had a clue about the Communist Manifesto, or even capitalism in general. Quote, the pamphlet had been written for a small group of radical tailors and shoemakers in London, end quote. There were only 20 of them, so not a huge movement yet. And I don't know about you guys, but when I think of radicals, tailors and shoemakers definitely are the first thing that I think of, because those people, don't mess with those people. So several hundred of the manifestos were printed before the revolutions took place. Vea says, quote, a historian estimated only 1 in 100,000 revolutionaries read this obscure work. Marx threw himself into politics when the revolutions began, and he went back to Germany when revolution took place there. He edited a radical newspaper there, encouraging revolution and a war against Russia as the police of Europe. In 1849, the revolutions fizzled out, and Marx was exiled from Germany. In August 1849, Marx moved with his family to London, where a lot of political exiles went. Marx would live there until his death in 1882 and would be buried there. While in London for 34 years, he worked in the library at the British Museum, continuing to write. In 1876, he published the first volume of Das Kapital that only happened since Engels, quote, begged him to stop rewriting and, quote, begged him to stop revising and rewriting. Wow. Begged him to stop revising and rewriting. That is hard to say for some reason, and I can relate to that as well. The other volumes were finished by Engels from notes after Marx's death. Now, in the lecture, Dr. Veas is going to take a more in-depth look at Marx's theory of history and economics. Does that sound fun, everybody? No. And we'll get into some Marxist vocabulary that, quote, yielded terms that over the next 100 years were used to win arguments, plan revolution, and define Marxist orthodoxy, end quote. Marx's theories reacted most of all to the rapidly changing 19th century world around him, from industrialization and to the establishment of what would be called capitalism. Capitalism is, quote, an economic system operating in a free market with private ownership of the means of production, following the competitive pursuit of profit in hiring labor, in buying and selling commodities, end quote. Capitalism grew out of a commercial revolution in Western Europe in the 17th century, quote, especially in the Netherlands and Britain, and it spread throughout Europe by the 19th century. Capitalism was a term socialists used as denunciation, socialists that Marx called utopian socialists. They wanted to get society to turn against capitalism and create something very different. Again, Marx felt capitalism was, quote, near its collapse. Obviously not a psychic, right? So why was Marx certain of capitalism's impending collapse at the time? Marx said, quote, history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, end quote. He thought capitalism was not the final, natural, and stable state of human organization, but a phase in historical evolution. Dr. Veas says, quote, the aim of historical evolution was the progressive liberation of human beings, but a collective liberty, not the individual liberty championed by classic liberalism, which Marx saw as selfish. And okay, this dude was selfish, and I'll talk about that later. So let me stop right there, though, and highlight what classical liberalism is. This is not what we think of in the U.S. as liberalism. It's different and kind of more what the European countries kind of see as what liberalism is. It's very different from what we see. So classical liberalism is described in, I think it's pronounced Mises or Mises.org, MISES.org. Quote, classical liberalism is the term used to designate the ideology advocating private property, an unhampered market economy, the rule of law, constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion and of the press, and international peace based on free trade. Another description from ScienceDaily.com describes, quote, classical liberalism is a political philosophy and ideology belonging to liberalism, in which primary emphasis is placed on securing the freedom of the individual by limiting the power of the government, end quote. From that description, I am very liberal, and before I've said that I have both liberal and conservative views and vote independent. But notice that classical liberalism is really not really quite what we have here as liberalism. I mean, I think there are some people who are classical liberalists that really hold true to that system. But I really feel that kind of what's taken over today as liberalism in the Democratic Party is more of a social justice ideology. Back to the lecture. Veas says about Marx's views, quote, at its base, history was economic, and it expressed itself in a series of clashes between classes, following their objective economic interests as society moved through different stages defined by changing means of production. Marx wrote, quote, the hand mill gives you a society with a feudal lord, the steam mill a society with industrial capitalists. So basically, Marx saw all society and how we function in it due to production. Matter and means of production shape ideology and ideas, which in turn maintains the matter and means of production. So in my understanding, an example would be if the base of society, let's say, was focused on robotics as a means of production, and then robotics would shape our values, our art, laws, social norms, family, etc. And those ideologies and ideas would maintain robotic production. Marx thought, quote, even religion was a reflection of economic interest, or a kind of narcotic for economic misery. So that's nice. Marx saw capitalism as the next to the last stage of development, the last stage being communism. He did see that industrial capitalism brought about some progressive things, binding the world together, bringing about globalization, making the world more cosmopolitan, and it accomplished some incredible development. Quote, the bourgeoisie had played a revolutionary role, but in the end, everything had been reduced to a commodity. Human relations became cold, callous, cash nexus, and all earlier certainties in morality dissolved into air. The labor of workers became a commodity, end quote. Marx was excited to discover out of capitalism what he called surplus value, which defined by dictionary.com in Marxian economics, the part of the value of a commodity that exceeds the cost of labor regarded as profit of the capitalist, end quote. So he and Engels thought that this discovery was equivalent to Darwin's in the natural world. More laborers were exploited, so the more laborers were exploited, the more their station got worse, quote, in the process of immersion, end quote. Then society polarized, with the rich being a very small percentage and the poor growing very large. The competition of capitalists grew. The bourgeoisie who failed to succeed under capitalism ended up sinking into the working classes, making that class grow bigger. This highlighted the fact that the proletariat was a different kind of class, quote, a universal savior class, end quote. Marx saw history as purposeful, heading toward a final struggle that would lead to world communism, where it wasn't divided by country, since Marx said, quote, the worker has no country, but rather are bound to other proletariats in their class, end quote. Marx's revolution would abolish all exploitation and hierarchy. The workers would take control and abolish all other classes. The state would be snuffed out as politics would no longer exist. Technology and labor would work together to provide for the world and bring about a different society under communism. The manifesto stated, quote, the theory of the communist may be summed up in a single sentence, abolition of private property, end quote. In Das Kapital, Marx said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, end quote. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels had 10 steps to lead toward communism, but they didn't really have anything explained in detail at all. In the German ideology written in 1845 and 1846, Marx and Engels wrote, quote, a revolution is required because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the working class that dislodges it needs a revolution itself. A revolution that will purge the proletariat of the accumulated trash of its past. Only thus can the worker rebuild society, end quote. So human society needed to be torn up in order to become a new civilization. Marx extolled, quote, radical rupture, end quote, in every aspect of life in the manifesto. He said, quote, communism abolishes eternal truths, abolishes all morality. Communism abolishes eternal truths, abolishes all religion and morality instead of constituting them on a new basis, and therefore acts as a contradiction to all past historical experience, end quote. So tear down all the statues, change the definitions of the dictionary, abolish the police, cancel everything, right? Next, Viz shifts to communist gossip. So in exile in London, the Marx family lived in really bad conditions, as I had said before. His kids had to lie to debt collectors that came trying to look for their dad. Only 3 of his 7 children ended up surviving to adulthood, probably because of their poor conditions and getting sick and not being able to afford a doctor, I am assuming. His wife, Jenny, actually had to borrow money once to afford a coffin for his daughter, or their daughter that died, which is sad. They got evicted. Jenny had some breakdowns, which is understandable, living with him probably, and their lifestyle. I mean, she was the daughter of a baron, so I'm sure this was not the life that she had intended for herself. And Marx only really tried getting a job like once, but he got turned down because of his crappy handwriting. He did do some writing for a newspaper in New York, but Engels mostly wrote the articles in Marx's name. Nice friend, and you'll see how nice of a friend this guy is. Engels actually also gave rave reviews of Marx's first volume of Das Kapital, not revealing that he was Marx's intellectual partner. And Engels was actually the provider financially to the Marx family. He went back to work at his dad's factory that he hated to support them for over 30 years. Remember when I said Marx was selfish earlier? Yeah, practice what you preach, bro. Also, Marx, who denounced, quote, middle-class men's sexual exploitation of women, end quote, had an affair with the housekeeper and got her pregnant. But good old Engels lied and said that it was his kid, and then they carted the kid off to foster care. So this is all wonderful, isn't it? Engels ended up actually confessing that truth on his deathbed. And Engels, he had that affair with Mary Burns that we talked about before. And then when she died, he moved in with her sister and had an affair with her. And Jenny Marx refused to see either of his mistresses socially. She did not approve of his relationships. And then when Lizzie died, it actually there was a break in the Marxist friendship with him for a little while. Okay, enough gossip. So Marx in exile, he mulled over what went wrong in France's failed revolutions in 1848. He explained the failure in his work, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, as the fault of the lumpen proletariat, helping Napoleon III gain power. Now, lumpen proletariat is defined by Oxford Languages as, quote, the unorganized and unpolitical lower orders of society who are not interested in revolutionary advancement, end quote. Marx highlighted that, quote, on occasion, the state might take an autonomous role in making history, end quote. He concluded that, quote, the middle classes would not be trusted even to play their own historical role, and the workers should have parallel organizations to keep pressing the revolution forward, end quote. Marx was anticipating another wave of turmoil at this stage, and also during this period, Marx and Engels focused on Russia. They hated Russia. It was conservative and imperialist, and they saw the mostly agrarian society as backward. Oddly enough, though, Marxism would come into power for the first time in Russia through Lenin in 1917, so that's kind of funny. Marx and Engels saw Slavic people as uncivilized. Quote, smaller nations would have to fuse with larger ones in the interest of progress, and war with Russia would be progressive, end quote. Engels wrote in 1849, quote, the universal war which is coming will crush the Slav and will wipe out completely those obstinate peoples so that their very name will be forgotten. The next world war will wipe out not only reactionary classes and dynasties, but it will also destroy those utterly reactionary races. That will be a real step forward. That sounds really nice, doesn't it? So the Soviets actually had to edit out that part of his writings when they embraced Marxism, since that would not have gone over very well. Engels also wrote, there is no country in Europe which does not contain in some corner of several ruins of people, leftovers, of earlier inhabitants, pushed back and made subject to the nation which later became the carrier of historical development. These remains of nations, which have been mercilessly trampled down by the passage of history, as Hegel expressed it, the ethnic trash always becomes the remains until its complete extermination or denationalization, the most fanatic carrier of counter-revolution, since its entire existence is nothing more than a protest against a great historical revolution, end quote. So he was not into multiculturalism, and it says that his views were similar to Hitler's. So there you go. Vea says we need to add a footnote here that Marx's thoughts were never fully finished or set in stone. He was constantly revising. Marx received a question from a Russian socialist, Vera Zasulich, in 1881. She asked if Russia would have to go through an industrial revolution first before they could reach socialism. And Marx was vague in his response, showing that he was open to other paths to socialism. In London, Marx became actively political, and he and Engels helped found the International Working Men's Association in St. Martin's Hall. This association was active from 1864 to 1876. It was called the First International for short, and had representation from many different countries. And maybe even had 800,000 members by 1869, which, this is the goal for my channel. Let's get 800,000 followers, guys. Marx was on the General Council, and he mainly debated violently about who should belong and who should be kicked out. And apparently its members just disagreed about everything and were very divided, and this became a theme in the communist movement. So sign me up. I want to join. Oh, it's for men only, darn. In 1871, Marx got excited when it seemed the end of the establishment was near. Paris went up in flames again with the Paris Commune, and this was mistakenly attributed to Marx, which made him the enemy of the world #1. That will be explored in Lecture 4. We are done with Lecture 3. We made it. Thanks for hanging in, guys. I know it's kind of a lot, but I appreciate that you're here with me on this wonderful journey. But before I go, it's time for communism and socialism in the news. I saw a news article from the New York Post on August 17th titled Kim Jong-un orders pet dogs to be confiscated in North Korean capital. The article states, quote, North Korea dictator Kim Jong-un has ordered pet dogs to be confiscated in the country's capital, saying pooches represent Western decadence, but their owners fear Fido is really headed for someone's dinner table. Kim issued the directive in July to round up the dogs, claiming they were part of a tainted trend by bourgeoisie ideology. A source told the English edition of Chosun Ilbo, a South Korean newspaper. Ordinary people raise pigs and livestock on their porches, but high-ranking officials and wealthy own pet dogs, which stoked some resentment among the lower classes, the source said. Authorities have identified the households of the pet dogs and are forcing them to give them up or forcefully confiscating them and putting them down. And essentially, people think it's really to feed people since there's a food shortage. So, wow, right? I mean, I know in some cultures they eat dog, but man, to take people's pets and they can't do anything about it. That is just heartbreaking and amazing. And oh my gosh, if someone tried to take Milton, I don't even know. These poor people. So that's messed up. And I left that article link in the description box so you can read the entire thing and just enjoy that thought. So great way to end this on such a happy note, right? No dictators, please. Yeah. So anyways, that's awful. But we're done. And I will actually not be posting on next Thursday because I'm going to be out on vacation. So I'll give you a little break from communism and Marxism, and you can think of something else for a little bit. But remember, my thoughts are my own. We may not agree, but I still love you.